Thank you. So this project is on, right. So I'm Kyle Chan. I'm a PhD student in political science at the UNC.
I'm Michelle Correa. I am an incoming student at UNC Political Science Department.
Hi, I'm Tim McDade, political science at Duke.
Mateo Villamizar, political science, first year Duke.
I'm Molly Jacobs. I'm an assistant professor at East Carolina University and a health economist and microeconometrician.
Okay, so now we're ready. So this project first started out as sort of like a check on like how useful machine learning and deep learning techniques can be when it comes to classification. So I was just wondering, well, we have a lot of data on party manifestos. There is like a huge corpus, and there is also like hand-coded data. But I'm just wondering, with all these fancy techniques we've been learning in the Summer Institute, like how like accurate these techniques could be when it comes to classification. Turns out, over the course of doing the analysis, it turns into sort of an existential crisis for somebody who studies political parties, because it turns out the machine sort of telling you that, well, it seems like parties are not that different. So over the course, the research questions sort of like became how meaningful are like the labels to different parties. So for example, a party can claim that they're conservative. A party can claim that they are liberal. A party can claim that they're social democratic. But how informative are those labels? So that is the sort of the research question we're going to take a look at in the project. So in the presentation, we're gonna we have done several analyses. So first, I'm gonna talk a little bit about data, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about the unsupervised learning stuff we've done to sort of like classify political parties based on their based on the hand-coded data we have with the project with the manifesto project. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the content analysis of the actual corpus. So all the party manifestos, we've done some text analysis on it, and we're going to see how the classification goes. And then we have some conclusions. So a note on the Comparative Manifestos project. It's run by a team of political scientists in Germany. They have been collecting a lot of data. So the oldest data go all the way to the 40s. And there are information for parties in all over the world. But mostly on Europe and Latin America, where you have a lot more parties to look at. So there are two parts of the data. So one, as I mentioned, there is hand-coded data. So they're looking at what's the portion being discussed in terms of a topic. So for example, what is the proportion of the manifesto spends on immigration? What is the proportion that's being spent on healthcare? And the other side of the project is the corpus of the manifestos. And I'm going to hand over to Tim to talk a little bit about the unsupervised stuff that begins with PCA.
Great. So we had about 142 variables. Like Kyle was mentioning, the immigration, economic policy, defense policy, things like that, that these manifestos talk about. And 142, that's a lot. You can't do a graph in 142 dimensions. So we decided to do some sort of dimensionality reduction. Does this mic work too? Okay, so we did just basic principal components analysis. And this is a graph of the explained variance on the y-axis for the number of principal components that we use. We picked a fairly high number of principal components. We just went for 40 because it explained a really high proportion of the variance. We could repeat that with any lower number of components, but we would sacrifice a bunch of the variance to be explained in the data. So we went and did our unsupervised learning based on those, with our inputs being those 40 principal components. This heat map represents the extent to which each principal component is comprised of each feature. On the x-axis is the feature name, and on the y-axis is the principal component. I realize it's a bit illegible. The labels don't really mean a ton anyway. This is just to give a sense of the extent to which the features were uninformative in yellow, or which were informative of liberal tendency, which would be the green, or informative of conservative tendency, which would be the red. And then I'll toss it to Kyle to talk about the k-means clustering.
Okay, so we have done k-means clustering to take a look at how well does the machine, how does the machine sort of like group the different parties. And we selected the first 4 components because we've looped over all the 40 components trying to plot them. It turns out once you go over the 4th component, they basically just clump together. So it's not very informative. So we're only looking at the first 4 components. This is the best result we could get. And you can see that there are really some clusters. You can see that there, for example, there are like parties that are green, the parties are blue. Well, the black dots are the means of the clusters. And you can see that while there are some clusters, but still the means of the clusters are not really apart. So they're still sort of like stacking together. So in that case, probably what the analysis suggests is that maybe political parties, when it comes to their different proportions spent on each policy, they're not that different. And if you're wondering what those 3 components are, component 0, I looked at it, it's mostly about liberalism, sort of like they talk about equality, human rights, democracy. Component 1 is more about the environment, or more about investment in infrastructure and technology. And component 2 is more about the free market economy, or about incentives for the economy. So you look at that, the parties are sort of like talking pretty much about the same thing in that sense, because they're still sort of lumped together. The outlier dot there, that's very interesting. I looked at what that is. It turns out it is mostly parties that have almost nothing in the coding. And I looked at what those parties are. They're usually parties that emerge during shocks, economic shocks, political crises. So I would say that these parties are not missing a random, so that's why I left it there. But moving forward, definitely will be interesting to see what kind of like specifically what sort of make them clump together so well, because it's just one dot there. There are also other combinations of the 4 components, but they're not that different. They're like lumped together. You can see some clusters, but they're still lumping together. And I will hand over back to Tim to talk about the deep learning stuff that we've done.
So after we did the clustering, we took a neural network approach to classification. This is a multi-classification that we did. Well, we tested it by two manners. The first of which was a test and training set split. The second was a k-fold cross-validation. We got a lot better results with the test and training split. 41.7% accurate classification. Now that may not sound that great, but keep in mind that we had 12 groups. So if you guessed at random, you would get about 8.5% accuracy. So 41.7%, we're fairly content with that. Not to say there's nothing to improve upon, there certainly is. However, when we do k-fold cross-validation, the accuracy dropped to about 25.6%. We didn't dive really deep into different assessment metrics, but that's certainly something that we will do in the future. Now, we did try a couple other machine learning techniques. Nearest neighbors, we got about 24% success, and SVC got about 23%.
So once we defined the dimensionality of the different indices that were classifying and categorizing these manifestos, what we thought the next logical step to do is just do a text analysis on them. And in that sense, we divided ourselves into 3 different ways of analyzing these texts, and to see if the results were similar to what we were seeing in the principal components analysis, or if there were something else that the text was capturing. So the first one of the first exercise was just looking at a basic topic models and just doing LDA over 2 different groups. One, we just chose English-speaking countries to make our language processors different. We didn't want to rely or use any of the translation machines that might be used, Once, because it just complicates things a little bit too much, and second, because the dictionaries will be hard to build. And then we're just using what was already given there, given time constraints. The other division that we did is just like divide by each one of these types of parties to see if actually there's like a division among the categorization of them, or they're just like merged the same. So here we have a histogram divided by country and by each one of these categories, and this will be like this will be our sample for the next exercises. After all, we played with running this. We started like with 10 categories, and then we went down and down, and we thought that around 4 was the optimum level to actually understand or have distinct categories, even though as Kyle already mentioned, they're not distinct among many of them. So just to show you some of the results here for Australia and for Ireland, if you actually see the first 3 words in category 1 in both, it's govern, labor, and support. We also have, well, it was not that. It was govern, nation, and labor, and we have a mention of these texts in all of them. So we tried this in different combinations, but exactly the same words were coming up, and exactly the same sort of categories are coming from there. So it's very, very interesting, because it's the idea that we're like sort of going through here, that maybe manifestos are not a very good informational tool for voters or for parties, and there's not much difference among them, and their corpus are very, very similar. Also, if we look at the different types of parties where you would expect that there will be more variation, here I'm presenting our largest categories, that are Christian Democratic and Conservative parties. And also, if you see topic number 1, labor, govern, nation, for Christian Democratic parties, and for conservative parties, we have also labor and govern, nation, and then you have taxes. So we're not looking at a lot of variation. If you remember the results of the PCA analysis, we also see that all of them were merging together. So there's something about these sort of these sort of manifestos that is not generating enough variance and generating enough information for citizens. And this is like 2 more results, but I'm just gonna.
So then we moved to structured topic modeling. Basically the structured topic modeling, which you've heard a good bit about today. Being a non-political scientist and not having ever taken political science, the thing I found most interesting in looking at all these different English-speaking countries was the difference in the number of topics between countries that were politically different. For example, South Africa, only 4 topics are really the optimal number of topics that you would want to examine, whereas opposed to New Zealand or Australia, Ireland, or the UK, you found many more topics, and the topics had a lot more similarities. So you definitely can see distinctions in terms of the historical prevalence of the party structure in each of these countries.
All right. And so the third type of modeling that we wanted to use with just the text visualization was text networks. And so that was using the TextNet package. And that basically allowed us to feed in the manifestos from a given country, all of the ones that we had available for all the different parties within that country, and then be able to visualize how those parties relate to each other based on the text that's in their manifestos. And so what we saw was pretty consistent with what we would expect, where we see groupings of parties based on, or that kind of correlate to the party families that you would expect and that are already coded into the data set. And so the way to read this, basically, the parties are grouped by color. And so the color that indicates basically clustering of similar groups, just kind of at a high level. And then the edges or the links between those different nodes represent shared text between the manifestos. And so, for example, with Australia, those 3 that are in green are all the conservative parties. And in fact, they're all of the conservative parties that we have in the data set according to how they've been coded. So that's pretty consistent with what we would expect, because it's, again, just based on the text in their manifesto, and shows that they're pretty similar. And the other example that we have that's pretty interesting is South Africa, where you see that there's a link between the Democratic Alliance, Democratic Party, and the African National Congress. And Democratic Party is actually defunct now, but is heavily related to the Democratic Alliance, which basically evolved from that. But we see that all three of those are linked, and the Democratic Alliance and the Democratic Party are both coded as being liberal parties, whereas the ANC is coded as being social democratic. So even though it's not particularly revelatory that those three are connected and related, they are coded differently. And so we do see, kind of supporting the other observations that we've had, where we're not sure that the party differences in codings necessarily have that much meaning. This kind of supports that observation that we've had. And the one other thing that we wanted to note here is you'll see at the bottom of each of these, we have an alpha that's mentioned. And so that's a tuning parameter that's a part of the text network visualization. And it's basically a filter where the lower values of alpha are more restrictive, and then higher values are less restrictive. So what we found was using the default value of alpha, which is 0.25, when we tried to map South Africa, we were actually only getting 3 of the parties showing up. And so 3 were being filtered out because basically the links between them were so little that, it didn't meet the threshold to actually be mapped here. So we had to kind of bump up the alpha, and 0.4 was the one just kind of going up in 0.1 increments, starting at 0.1. That was the first one where we were actually able to get all of those parties mapped. And so that does introduce a little bit of uncertainty into some of the data that we're looking at, where we're basically saying that there's a possibility that less important words are now being coming into play here in the mappings. But ultimately, what we were seeing is that the party families pretty much make sense as far as what we would expect, but we do have a lot more overlap and intersection between different party families, which supports the initial argument that or the observation that we've already talked about here.
Just as some concluding remarks and future directions of this project, the first thing is that party manifestos seems harder to locate in a simple 2-dimensional space. So the PCA analysis were just showing that there's a lot of variance and a lot of dimensions that we need to take into account when we are categorizing parties. But it could be the existence of all these important categorizations and variables which makes them hard to distinguish from one another. One of the main issues that we had with the PCA is that we were dealing here with sort of a categorical variable, whereas like most of the machine learning stuff is better suited for binary outcomes. So even given this restriction, I think that our 40% prediction using machine learning about this categorization is pretty good with what we were giving so far. However, they're still very similar to one another. And this is just like the same as we were looking, and the same as the results of the text analysis of the English-speaking language countries and manifestos. What is interesting here also is that independent of their ideological classifications, parties don't seem to show a lot of variation in their manifestos. English-speaking countries show the same. We also run at least the first 2 exercises for Spanish-speaking countries, and we're getting exactly the same results. The same words are being on the top of these manifestos, and then variation is not that much. If you're interested in showing that, we have them in our codings, and they're all available for you. So the final idea and what we want to take this later is maybe transform this into some sort of paper and a longer term project, and just asking if manifestos are good informational tools for parties, or if they create any important information for voters, or like what are the role of manifestos in terms of signaling and information to voters. So thank you very much, and all our code, you can find it here if you want to play with it, or if you have any comments on these results. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
So I don't know if this makes any sense, but it seems that the top words that I think are like universal, they sound good, like, our nation, equity, equality, some things you'd expect to find in any manifesto. So would it make sense to kind of remove these top words and then dig deeper, like the dominant ideas that we would expect to find in anything that's supposed to sound good, and then kind of go down to more details and it's not dominated by those top words. And I don't know if that would make sense in this context, but
I think it absolutely makes sense, and we need to play a little bit more building our dictionary. I think if we take away all the common words that might be common about the manifestos, we might be able to get to some more like minimum distinctions between parties. But still, like we also deleted some of these words that we thought that were like very common, especially if you're looking at one country, then we eliminated all the derivations of the country name. But still there are things that keep appearing, and the idea behind it is like it might not be necessarily that, because they all use the same words and they all try to use like all these important words. That's where the non-variation comes from.
Also, non-variation is evident in the different variables, the feature variables that we saw in the data set, where the manifesto talked about a particular substantive policy and the positive or negative association they had with that policy as coded by these political scientists. He's totally right. We do need to dig more, absolutely. But also our unsupervised learning that was based on the percentage features was not entirely inconsistent with the structural topic models and the hot words that we saw crop up in all of the things. So we don't think we're completely off base here, but we do absolutely want to refine the dictionary and everything that we're working with.
Okay, so this is a question followed by, if you were going down this route, I have something you might want to look at. So you said you were just at English at this time, but you were looking to do Spanish. Were there any other languages in the party manifestos that you were looking at doing in the future?
Yeah, we can, but the problem is we don't speak them, number one, and number two, sample size gets restricted when you say only look at Dutch, which has one country.
Yeah, at the end we ended up choosing English because it had like 5 countries that we can actually use. We then start looking things in Spanish because there were also another 5 countries. But because the rest of the variation from the data set comes from Europe, then you have like one country, one language kind of thing. So building these tools, we went more for sample size rather than from definition. But definitely, with the things we have now, we are able to switch them to just have one of these results per language, kind of.
The reason I asked this is because, one, this is really neat. And I think you said there was like a defunct party in South Africa. I mean, this could possibly explain some of those pendulum swings that we see in terms of the ideologically moving from very conservative to very liberal, and even how you get that more moderate period in between those swings, although it's getting a lot more rapid fire in the past 2 decades. But in terms of language, if you might want to look at some of the literature of linguistics when you get outside of English, they said with English speakers, we're very visual. So we don't do a very good job communicating sometimes through text and through language about how we feel about something, because we are more likely to use images. I don't know what it would be in Spanish or some of the Latin-based languages. But if you're interested, they said, I think Chinese speakers and a number of other languages are going to be highly dependent on other type of sensory experiences when they're speaking and when they're writing, which is something that doesn't translate to us English speaking folks, because we're visual, right? I don't know if that would impact how you move forward with it, but it might be a consideration to look at somebody that studies linguistics and how we were able to express ourselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll look into that body of literature. At the moment, the main body of literature that we see that's contributing to, whenever we get it good enough to push it out, is the voter behavior, voter decision-making behavior. At least in the U.S., general consensus in the literature is party identification makes up almost all, or is by far and away the best predictor of voter behavior.
Which is something we can't control.
Which is something we can't really control for. So one thing we're interested in here is looking at the edge cases of the language in the party manifestos, and really kind of showing how the parties double down on these tiny little marginal differences between their platforms and use that as a way to lever the party identification of their voters to attract the maximum number of votes.
I had a question about whether you explored, like, just there's a lot of news coverage of like how, like Brexit and things happening in the United States have, echo each other or resemble each other. And I was curious if you did any sort of like a cross-country comparisons looking at maybe how rhetoric somewhere might impact somewhere else.
That's another excellent question. One which we ran into a problem with because the temporal distribution of these party manifestos is not even. It's not like the Republican Party puts out a manifesto every single year or whatever in every country for every party. You'll get one in year 1, and then you'll get another one in year 7. You'll get another one in year 23. So it's not. I would love to. I'm doing a research project right now on democratic backsliding. I'm fascinated in that sort of phenomenon.
But your neural network kind of touches on the within and between variation that you get.
Yeah, absolutely. But temporally, it's really hard to pin down.
Yeah.
Any more questions? All right, round of applause.